She walked into the church wearing her sister's wedding dress, and no one knew that the real bride had run away 3 hours earlier. On one side was a bankrupt family drowning in debt, on the verge of losing everything. On the other was the most powerful man in the city, a man whose name even the criminal underworld dared not utter. Avery Callahan didn't love him. She'd never even spoken to him. But when the wedding curtain was lifted, those dark eyes stared straight at her, and the slow smile on his lips made her heart stop. He knew. He knew from the beginning, and he still let the wedding go on. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come, and stay until the end, because this is only the beginning. The dress didn't fit right across the shoulders. Avery had known that from the moment she'd pulled the zipper up in the dark of her sister's bedroom, one hand braced against the vanity mirror, teeth clenched, listening to the sound of her own breathing instead of the chaos happening 3 floors below. Lena was 2 inches shorter and built narrow through the chest. The ivory satin pulled where it shouldn't and sat loose where it should have cinched. Avery had stood in front of that mirror for 40 seconds. She'd counted, telling herself the guests wouldn't notice. The guests would be looking at the chandeliers, at the flowers, at the open bar. They would not be looking at the seam beneath her left arm. She'd been telling herself a lot of things in the last 3 hours. She'd been telling herself that Lena would come back, that her sister had only panicked, that she'd turn up in the lobby of the Moretti estate with her mascara ruined and a reasonable explanation. She told herself that right up until she found the note on the vanity. Not even a full page, just 7 lines in Lena's slanted handwriting, the ink slightly smeared at the bottom like she'd been crying while she wrote it, or crying while she ran. I can't do it. I love someone else. Don't hate me. Tell Mom and Dad I'm sorry. Tell them I'll fix it somehow. I know I won't. I'm sorry, Avery. I'm sorry. No name for the someone else, no address, no return timeline, just the apology and the dress, and the $3 million debt that their father had restructured twice in the past 18 months, using Moretti money as the foundation. Avery had sat on the edge of the bed for 4 minutes after that. She'd read the note twice. Then she'd folded it into a square and put it in the vanity drawer, stood up, and started doing her sister's hair, because someone had to. The Callahan family had been many things over the years, optimistic, overextended, occasionally foolish with money, but they had never, not once in 3 generations, defaulted on an agreement. Her father had told her that when she was 9. He'd been straightening his tie in the hallway mirror when he said it, heading out to some deal she didn't understand yet. And he'd said it the way people say things they want to be true badly enough to treat it as fact. We honor our word, Avery. That's the only thing that can't be taken from us. She'd believed him. She'd believed him all the way up until the moment it fell to her to honor a word she'd never given. The walk down the aisle was the longest of her life. The chapel inside the Moretti estate was not a public building. It was a private room, long and vaulted with pale stone walls and no windows on the ground level and light that came from somewhere above through panels of frosted glass that gave everything a color like old cream. There were perhaps 80 guests. Avery did not look at them. She looked at the floor ahead of her, at the faint pattern in the stone, at the hem of her own dress sweeping the ground, and she counted her steps because counting was the only thing she could do that felt like control. Her father walked beside her. His grip on her arm was not gentle. "Straight ahead," he murmured, voice low, barely moving his lips. "Don't look at anyone, just straight ahead." She didn't answer him. There was nothing to say to a man who had agreed to this arrangement without fully understanding what his daughter would have to become in order to fulfill it. At the front of the chapel, Dante Moretti was waiting. She had seen photographs. Her sister had shown her, nervous, laughing photographs pulled from gossip sites and financial pages. Dante Moretti cutting a ribbon at a waterfront development. Dante Moretti at a benefit dinner. Dante Moretti in the background of someone else's campaign photograph, looking like he'd wandered in from a different and more dangerous world. In the photographs, he looked contained, controlled, like a man who had decided at some point what expression to wear in public, and had not varied it since. In person, he was taller than she'd expected, and the control was real. Not performed, not a mask over visible tension, just actual stillness. The kind that comes from a man who has never needed to fidget because stillness has always served him better. He wore black. The suit was expensive and cut close, and he stood with both hands loose at his sides and watched her walk toward him with an expression that gave her absolutely nothing. Avery kept counting her steps. The officiant, a compact older man with careful eyes and the measured cadence of someone accustomed to ceremonies where the emotional temperature was dangerously unpredictable, led them through the opening. The words went past Avery like water. She was managing her breathing. She was managing the angle of her chin and the set of her shoulders and the distance between her feet, and she was doing all of it simultaneously while her heart hammered at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. She told herself, "He doesn't know. He has no reason to know. You look like her. You sound like her. You've been doing her voice since you were 11 years old in the back seat of your mother's car. You can do this for 20 minutes." Then they asked her to turn and face him, and Dante Moretti reached up and lifted her veil. She looked at him. He looked at her. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds. It felt architectural, like something that had been built and lived in. Then Dante smiled. Not wide, not warm, a small, precise thing that moved the corner of his mouth and reached absolutely nowhere near his eyes. "Welcome home, Avery," he said, barely above a whisper. Not for the room. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt it. A physical dropping sensation like stepping off a curb you didn't see. Her fingers went cold. For one moment, she was certain her knees would go, that she would simply fold at the altar in her sister's dress in front of 80 people, and whatever came after that would be worse than anything she'd managed to imagine. Her knees didn't go. She stayed standing, which was its own kind of miracle, and she looked at Dante Moretti's calm, measuring face and understood 3 things simultaneously. He had known before she walked in, he had chosen to let it proceed, and she had absolutely no idea what that meant for her. The officiant continued. The words kept going. Dante held her gaze for a breath longer, then turned back toward the front of the room as though nothing had happened. As though he hadn't just quietly detonated everything she thought she understood about the situation. She repeated the vows when prompted. She heard herself say the words. She didn't feel them. When he slid the ring onto her finger, she noticed his hands were steady. Completely steady. Not even a tremor. She thought distantly that she hated him a little for that. Outside afterward, under the cold white light strung above the estate's east terrace, the guests mingled with the careful, calculated ease of people who understood that social warmth was a professional performance in this room. Avery stood at the edge of it, a glass of champagne in her hand that she hadn't drunk from, and tried to remember how to occupy her own body normally. A woman she didn't recognize touched her arm. 40s, dark lipstick, hair pinned tight. "Lena," the woman said, "you look beautiful. Dante's mother would have loved this." "Thank you," Avery said. Lena's voice, Lena's small, practiced smile. "That means a great deal." The woman moved on. Avery exhaled once, careful and controlled, through her nose. 3 hours. She needed to get through the evening, get inside, get her bearings, and figure out what Dante Moretti actually wanted. Because men like that, men who absorbed a deception at the altar without blinking, who whispered your real name like they'd been holding on to it, they always wanted something. She just needed to understand what it was before he told her. Dante materialized at her shoulder sometime after 11, the way he apparently moved through all spaces, without announcing himself and without seeming to have traveled from anywhere specific. "You handled that well," he said. Avery kept her eyes on the terrace below. "I don't know what you're talking about. You had about 2 seconds where I thought you might faint." "I wasn't going to faint." "No," he agreed. "You weren't." There was something in his voice that might have been approval, or might have been assessment. Hard to separate the two with him, she was already learning. "Come inside. There are things we need to discuss." "Now." "The guests will be occupied for another 2 hours. This is the window." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer to keep performing for them." She turned and looked at him fully. It was the first time she'd done it since the altar, since that whispered name, and she had expected to feel more afraid doing it. She felt something sharper than fear, actually. She felt anger, clean and clarifying, because he'd set this up with perfect information and she'd walked in blind and that asymmetry was going to end. "After you," she said. His study was on the 2nd floor, past a landing where 2 men stood positioned without making eye contact with anyone. and through a door that Dante opened with a key he produced from his jacket pocket rather than a keypad or a reader. The room was large and dense with paper. Not messy, but layered, the way working spaces look when the person using them actually works in them rather than staging them for visitors. Floor-to-ceiling shelving, a desk with two monitors that were dark, maps on one wall, physical ones, with marks on them that she didn't understand yet. He poured water from a decanter on the side table and set a glass in front of her without asking. She didn't touch it. He sat, not behind the desk, but in one of the two chairs facing it, which she suspected was deliberate, not putting the desk between them, not making it official in that way. She stayed standing. "Sit down, Avery. Explain how you knew first. I've known your name since you were 7 years old. Sit down." She sat because her legs were tired and she was done pretending otherwise. "That's not an explanation. It's the beginning of one." He studied her for a moment. His jacket was open, tie loosened now, and he looked more comfortable in this room than he had in the chapel, which made sense because this was clearly where he actually lived. "Your sister is with Marcus Vieri. I've known about that for 4 months. I allowed the engagement to proceed regardless." Avery went very still. "You knew Lena was going to run." "I knew it was possible. I made accommodations." "You arranged for her to have a replacement." "No." Something shifted at the edge of his expression. Not quite sharpness, not quite insult. "I arranged for you to have a reason to step in if you chose to, which is different." "How is that different?" "Because you could have said no." She looked at him. "My family's debt exists regardless of tonight. I could collect on it or not collect on it entirely independent of whether there was a wedding. You know that." He tilted his head slightly. "You stepped in because of the debt, yes, but also because that's who you are. You didn't want anyone else to suffer the consequences." She didn't answer that because it was accurate, and she resented how accurately he'd read it. "What did you need Lena for?" she asked instead. "The real reason. Because men in your position don't get married for normal reasons." "No, they don't." "So." He was quiet for a moment. In the silence, she could hear something from outside, cars, distant, and the muffled sound of music from the terrace, the party continuing without them. "You and your sister were in the same place at the same time 20 years ago," he said. "March, Eastfield. You would have been 6, maybe 7. The word Eastfield did something strange to her. Not a memory exactly, more like the physical outline of a memory, a shape without content. She felt her jaw tighten without deciding to. You don't remember it clearly." "I know." He leaned forward, arms on his knees. "Most of it was suppressed, probably deliberately, but it's coming back, isn't it?" She looked at her hands. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're lying to me," he said without heat, "which is fair, but we're going to have to get past that." She looked up. "You have an entire estate full of men with weapons, and you just married a woman you knew was an imposter. You want to talk to me about lying?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not the altar smile, something less calculated than that. Almost real. "Fair," he said. She thought, not for the first time that evening, that she was in a great deal of trouble. But it was a specific kind of trouble now. The kind with edges, with shape, with a center she might be able to find if she kept her head. That was better than the blind kind. Marginally. "What happened in Eastfield?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He stood, moved to the desk, and opened a drawer. What he placed in front of her was a photograph. Black and white, grainy, clearly from surveillance footage printed onto standard paper. A street, a crowd, people moving. In the left foreground, blurred from motion, the back end of a long dark car. And in the background, barely visible between two adults who were both caught mid-motion with their faces partially turned away, a small girl in a yellow coat. The girl's face was turned toward the camera, wide-eyed, terrified, caught in the exact moment before something very bad happened, frozen there in the grain of the image. Avery didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the yellow coat. She looked at the face. She knew the face. It was hers. The room tilted slightly, or felt like it did, and she pressed the heel of her palm flat against the surface of the desk to keep herself anchored. The coat. She hadn't thought about the yellow coat in more than 15 years, hadn't consciously remembered it, but now it was right there, immediate and physical. And with it came the smell of rain-wet concrete and something burning and the distant sound of screaming that she had spent 2 decades filing away under nightmare rather than memory. "That's the Eastfield explosion," Dante said quietly. He wasn't looking at the photograph. He was looking at her. March 14, 20 years ago. 6 people died. My father was one of them. Her throat had gone dry. "I remember—" She stopped. "Take your time." She shook her head. The images came in fragments. Rain, headlights cutting through it, a man in a dark coat handing something to another man, the weight of something small and metal in her fist. "I was there with—" The shape of a face swam up and dissolved. "I can't. I know." He reached out and turned the photograph face down on the desk, gently, which she didn't expect from him. "It's all right. It'll come in pieces. That's how it works." "How do you know how it works?" "Because I've spent 20 years trying to find you." He said it plainly, not with weight, not with drama, like a fact he'd learned to say without the emotion getting in the way first. Avery stared at him. "I'm not—" She exhaled hard. "You knew who I was when you set up this engagement. You've been looking for me for 20 years, and you found me, and you arranged a marriage. I arranged proximity," he said. "I needed you inside this house. I needed you somewhere I could protect you while you remembered. Because when you start to remember—" He paused. His voice had shifted very slightly, something colder underneath it now. "People are going to come for you, and they're going to do it fast." She was on her feet before she registered standing. The chair was behind her. "I need to leave." "Avery, I need to. I'm not. This isn't—" She stopped herself, pressed her mouth shut, breathed. Her hands were shaking, and she hated that he could see it, hated that she'd lost control of her body twice in one evening in front of this man. When she opened her mouth again, her voice was level. "Tell me one true thing. Right now. One." He met her eyes. "Whoever put you in that street 20 years ago," he said, "killed my father, destroyed 3 families, and has been killing witnesses ever since. And until tonight, you were the only one left alive who saw his face clearly enough to testify." He held her gaze. "That changes now that you're here, which means that starting tonight, you are in more danger than you've been in your entire life. And also," a pause that was so brief she almost missed it, "possibly safer than you've ever been." She stood in the middle of Dante Moretti's study in her sister's wedding dress, with the photograph of her own 7-year-old face down on the desk, and understood that nothing that had happened in the last 12 hours had been the worst of it. The worst of it was coming. From somewhere below, distant and muffled through stone and glass, she heard the sound of the terrace party continuing. The clink of glasses, the low pulse of music, 80 people celebrating a marriage that barely any of them understood. And then, cutting through all of it, sharp and sudden, the unmistakable flat crack of a gunshot. Dante was already on his feet. "Stay here," he said. He moved toward the door and his voice had gone entirely flat. Not urgent, not afraid, just operational, the voice of someone shifting from one mode into another without any transition required. "What was that?" "Stay here." He turned back once, hand on the doorframe, and looked at her with something that might have been a warning or might have been an apology. "Lock it behind me." He was gone. The door pulled shut. Avery stood alone in the room where her husband had just told her she was both a target and a witness to a 20-year-old murder, with a photograph of her 7-year-old face on the desk, and the sound of running feet now audible in the corridor outside, and the distant noise of what was no longer music and glasses, but something considerably more chaotic. She moved to the door. She didn't lock it. She didn't lock the door. She knew she should. Dante had said it clearly, one direct instruction, and every rational part of her understood the logic. Stay, lock, wait. She was unarmed and untrained and wearing a dress that reduced her range of motion by roughly 40%. Staying was the intelligent choice. She moved to the window instead. The terrace below was in the early stages of chaos, which had its own specific visual grammar. Not yet screaming, not yet running, But the posture of 80 people shifting simultaneously from relaxed to alert, glasses lowered, conversation stopping mid-sentence, heads turning toward the same point. 3 of Dante's men were moving through the crowd with their jackets open. A woman near the bar had dropped her clutch and not picked it up. The lights were still on, which meant whoever had fired hadn't knocked out the power, which meant it was either a warning or a miss, or it was a beginning. Avery stepped back from the window when she saw the first man on the roof of the east wing, a silhouette against the pale night sky, moving fast and low along the parapet. He wasn't one of Dante's. She didn't know how she knew that, but she knew it the way you know certain things at the base of the spine before the brain catches up. She went to the desk. The drawer Dante had opened was still partially out. She pulled it further and looked inside. The photograph was gone. He'd taken it, but there were other papers beneath where it had sat, and there was also, pushed to the back corner, a small black device, roughly the shape and weight of a television remote, with a single red indicator light that was currently off. She had no idea what it did. She left it. There was a door at the back of the study, not the one Dante had used. She'd registered it when she sat down, half hidden behind the edge of the shelving unit, no handle visible from the front, which meant it opened from this side and was meant as an exit rather than an entrance. She crossed to it and found the inset lever and pulled. A narrow corridor. Not finished the way the rest of the house was. Bare plaster, a single strip of utility lighting overhead, the smell of old stone, and something electrical. A service passage. She moved into it and pulled the door mostly closed behind her and stood in the thin light and listened. She could hear voices from somewhere ahead, low, fast, the kind of voices that people use when they're trying to communicate quickly without being heard. One of them was Dante. She followed the sound. The corridor turned twice, and then terminated at a half staircase leading down. And at the bottom of the staircase there was a door that was open, and beyond the door there was a room she hadn't seen before. Basement level, stone floor, lit by overhead fluorescents that gave everything the flat clinical quality of a room that wasn't meant to look comfortable. There were filing cabinets. There were tables with paper spread across them, physical documents rather than digital, the kind of material you keep off servers because servers can be accessed. There were photographs pinned to a corkboard on the far wall, dozens of them, connected by colored string in a pattern she recognized from enough crime procedurals to feel her stomach drop slightly. 4 men were in the room. Dante stood nearest the door with his back partly toward her, talking to a broad man in his 50s with a broken nose that had healed slightly wrong and the hands of someone who'd been working with them since before he could vote. The other 2 were at the table, one on a phone, one studying the document spread in front of him. None of them had heard her come down. "One shot, east entrance, warning configuration," the broad man was saying. He had a voice like gravel in a metal drum. "Salteri's people." "Salteri doesn't move without instruction," Dante said. "He's too cautious for a solo play." "Maybe he got instructions." "From who? Hale's been quiet for 3 weeks." The name landed on the air, and Avery felt something happen in her chest that she couldn't immediately categorize. Hale. She didn't know anyone named Hale. She didn't think she knew anyone named Hale. But the name sat wrong in her head, the way a word sits wrong when you can feel that you know it from somewhere but can't locate the context. "Could be the Ferris crew," one of the men at the table said without looking up. "They've been sniffing around the northern docks again." "The Ferris crew does not take shots at a wedding reception," Dante said, and something in his voice ended that line of discussion. The broad man, Caruso, Avery would learn later, Dante's second, a man who had been with the Moretti family since before Dante was old enough to know what the family was, pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward Dante. Camera got a partial on the shooter, east roof. He was gone in under 4 minutes. Dante looked at the screen. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes tightened fractionally. "That's a message," he said, "not an attempt." "Telling us what?" "That they know she's here." The room went quiet. Even the man on the phone lowered it slightly. Avery pressed herself against the doorframe and breathed through her nose. "She's here." He hadn't said Lena. He'd said she. And the way every man in that room had processed it, the slight stillness, the recalibration, told her this was not new information to any of them, that they had all been waiting for this consequence. She stepped into the doorway. "Who knows I'm here?" she said. Every head in the room turned. Caruso moved a half step in front of Dante out of what appeared to be pure reflex, old instinct, body armor made of loyalty, before Dante's hand came up slightly and Caruso stopped. "I told you to stay upstairs," Dante said. "You told me to lock the door. I didn't lock the door." She came down the last 2 steps and into the room. Her heels on the stone floor made a sound that felt louder than it should have. "Who knows I'm here?" Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his men. "Give us the room," he said. Caruso looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't argue. The 4 of them filed out through a different door at the far end of the room, and Avery heard it close, and then it was just the 2 of them in the fluorescent light surrounded by 2 decades of paper and string and the muffled sounds of a party being quietly, efficiently shut down above them. "Sit down," Dante said. "Stop telling me to sit down. You've been on your feet for 6 hours in shoes that don't fit you, and you're running on adrenaline and no food. Sit down, Avery." She sat down. She hated that he was right about the shoes. They were Lena's shoes, and they were a full size too small, and her feet had been screaming since the ceremony, but she had not allowed herself to register it until he said it out loud. He pulled a second chair to the table and sat across from her and looked at her the way he'd looked at her since the altar. Measuring, patient, no wasted motion in the eyes. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough. Someone took a shot. You think it's a message. You think the message is about me." She held his gaze. "Someone knew I'd be here tonight. Not Lena. Me. Which means either the deception was known before tonight, or—" She stopped. "Or someone inside this house told them," he finished. "Yes?" The word inside sat between them like a thing with weight. "How many people knew I was coming instead of Lena?" 3. Myself, Caruso, and a woman named Petra who manages logistics for the estate. He paused. "Petra has been with this house for 11 years. Caruso for 22. And you trust them." "I trust Caruso without question. Petra I trust with 90% of my operational decisions, which means there is a 10% I've always kept from her." He said it plainly, no apology in it. The 10% included this. "Then how did anyone know?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said, and the admission cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight compression of his mouth. Dante Moretti was not a man accustomed to not knowing things, and the gap where the knowledge should have been was clearly producing something in him that he was working to contain. "Tell me about the files," she said. She gestured at the room around them. "All of this." He looked at her for another moment, as though calculating how much to give her and deciding in real time. Then he stood and moved to the corkboard on the far wall, and she stood and followed him, and they stood side by side in front of 20 years of evidence, and he began to talk. The Eastfield explosion, March 14th. 6 dead. 2 Moretti family associates, 1 city council aide, a driver, a woman whose connection to any of the others had never been publicly established. And Marco Moretti, Dante's father, the previous head of the family, 51 years old, described in every obituary as a developer and philanthropist. The explosion had been ruled a gas main failure within 72 hours of the incident. Dante had known it was wrong within 73 hours, because his father had called him from a payphone 40 minutes before the explosion and told him that something was moving and that Dante needed to be somewhere else that night. He knew it was coming, Avery said. He knew something was coming. He didn't know the scale. Dante's voice was even, but not empty. There was something underneath it that had been living underneath it for a long time and had learned to stay below the surface. "He sent me away. He didn't go himself." She didn't say anything to that. He moved along the board. The investigation was buried in the first week. The city official who initially flagged inconsistencies in the gas line report was transferred to a position in the North District 6 days later, retired within a year. The forensic contractor who did the site assessment was a company incorporated 3 months before the explosion and dissolved 4 months after. He touched a photograph. A man in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of face that photographed well because it was constructed to. Vincent Hale. At the time of the explosion, a mid-level financier with municipal connections and a reputation for quiet problem solving. In the 2 years following Eastfield, he acquired controlling interest in 4 financial institutions and 2 infrastructure contracts that had previously been held by families directly affected by the explosion. Avery stared at the photograph, the name again. Hale. It moved through her like a cold current. He profited from it, she said. He engineered it. Dante said it without drama, the way you say things you've had 20 years to process. The Moretti family controlled an underground financial network. Not clean money, I'm not going to pretend it was, but it was stable and it was substantial and it funded a significant portion of this city's infrastructure in ways that were never going to appear in the public record. Hale wanted access to that network. He couldn't buy it. He couldn't negotiate for it, so he destroyed the people who held it and moved into the vacuum. And the framing? 3 families were implicated in the explosion within the first 6 months. 2 of them were legitimate, business interests, no criminal connection, and they were destroyed anyway. It served the narrative, it served Hale. He paused. The Callahans were not on the original list. The name hit her like a flat hand to the sternum. She kept her face still. What? Your family was not involved in Eastfield. Your father was a contractor who did legitimate work for 2 of the affected parties. He was peripheral. Hale flagged him later, after the initial cleanup, because of something he found, or thought he found, in your family's past. He turned and looked at her. Your family's financial problems started 8 years ago, systematically. Not bad luck, not poor decisions, systematically. Avery turned away from the board. She needed to move. She walked to the far end of the room and stood facing the blank wall and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone and breathed in once, held it, breathed out. 8 years. Her father had told them the trouble started with a bad investment, a construction deal in the Eastern Development Zone that had fallen through, a domino effect. She had believed it. She had watched her parents sell the house in the hills, watched her mother stop buying the things she used to buy, watched her father age 5 years and 18 months with the particular exhaustion of a man being slowly dismantled. She had believed it was bad luck. She turned back around. He went after my family because of me, she said, because I was in that street. Because you saw something in that street, Dante said, something you haven't fully remembered yet. And because whoever you were with that day, whoever put you in the path of that explosion, they told someone, eventually, that there had been a witness, a child, too young to be credible, but old enough to remember, if the right thing triggered the memory. So he bled my family out until we were desperate enough to agree to anything. Her voice was very flat. And then you came in with the debt offer, and I needed you close. Yes. He held her gaze and did not look away. I'm not going to tell you that what I did was clean. I used your situation. I used your family's vulnerability, and I used your instinct to protect them. That's true. I did it because I've run out of approaches that don't involve leverage, and because you are the only living person who can finish what I've been trying to finish for 20 years. She stared at him. You want me to testify, she said. I want you to remember, he said. The testimony matters, but it's secondary. The primary evidence has been out of reach since the night of the explosion. He paused. Avery, what do you remember about leaving the street? The memory came before she could prepare for it. Not full, not complete, a fragment with edges. The smell of something burning, the cold of rain on the back of her neck, something small and hard in the palm of her hand, and her fingers closing around it the way children close around things they're not supposed to touch, because the thing looks important and therefore interesting. A man's voice, high and thin with something that wasn't quite panic but was panic adjacent, the voice of a person maintaining control while not having any. I picked something up, she said. Dante was very still. There was a man, before the explosion, just before, I think, or... She pressed her fingers to the side of her head. The images moved like shapes in water, close to the surface, and then gone. He was giving something to someone else, or he'd just given it. There was a watch, silver. It had writing on the inside of the cover. I remember seeing the inside of the cover because it was open. Someone had opened it. She stopped. Her hand came up to her mouth. I picked it up off the ground. It must have fallen. I put it in my coat pocket. The yellow coat. The deep front pocket of a child's winter coat, the kind with enough room to hold treasures. The watch had an engraving on the inside cover, Dante said. His voice was very controlled now. Vincent Hale's initials. And inside the watch, in a cavity behind the face, there was a microfilm strip containing the financial transaction records from a series of accounts that no longer officially exist. He stopped. That watch is the only physical evidence that connects Hale directly to the Eastfield accounts. It's the only thing that can prove the money moved the way it moved and that his hands were on the mechanism. Another stop. It has been missing for 20 years. She looked at him. You think I still have it? She said. I think it was put somewhere for safekeeping by a 7-year-old who didn't know what she had, and I think it has been in the same place ever since. He met her eyes. Where did you go after Eastfield? That night? Where did they take you? She tried. The memory dissolved. I don't know, she said. I can't. It's all right. He said it with a patience that she was beginning to understand was not softness. It was the patience of a man who had waited 20 years and could wait a little longer if the alternative was pushing her too hard and losing the thread. It'll come. We'll work through it. She exhaled. She moved back toward the table and looked at the spread of documents and felt the weight of 2 decades pressing down on the paper, all of it pointing toward a center she was apparently standing inside of without having chosen to. What happens when I remember? She asked. Realistically, what happens? We find the watch. We hand the records to a federal contact I've maintained for 3 years. A man who is not connected to Hale, who has been building a parallel case with circumstantial evidence, and who has been waiting for physical documentation to move on. He paused. Hale loses everything. The network dismantles. The families that were destroyed get some measure of what was taken from them. And you? I make decisions about this family that I've been postponing for a long time. She studied him. You want out. I want what my father wanted before someone decided to prevent it. He said it simply. He wasn't a good man in the way the world defines it, but he was moving towards something different. Hale killed him for it. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere upstairs she heard Caruso's voice, and then another voice, and then the sound of footsteps moving with purpose. She was about to ask another question when the far door opened and Caruso came back in, and the expression on his face, the particular tightening around the eyes that she would learn was his version of urgency, stopped everything else. We have a problem, Caruso said. Which problem? Dante said. The shooter. We pulled the full camera sequence. Caruso held up his phone and Dante took it and looked at the screen, and Avery watched Dante's face and saw something move through it that she hadn't seen before. Not fear, nothing so simple as fear, but a kind of cold arriving, a temperature drop behind the eyes. He handed the phone back without a word. What? She said. Caruso looked at Dante. Dante gave him nothing. The shooter, Caruso said, turning to her carefully. He came in through the East Service entrance, which requires a code, a current code. He stopped. The code was changed 4 days ago. Only 6 people in this house have the current sequence. The room settled into the particular quality of silence that happens when something everyone suspected becomes something everyone knows. One of your people, Avery said. Neither of them denied it. The weight of the evening, the ceremony, the name, the photograph, the memories beginning to move beneath the surface of everything she'd ever been told about her own life. All of it converged on that single point, and she felt something shift inside her, some load-bearing wall of the self giving slightly under the accumulated pressure. Not breaking, just recognizing the mass of what she was carrying. Then the lights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered, cut, completely, so that the room went from the flat white of fluorescence to absolute dark in a single beat. And in that darkness, Avery heard Dante move and heard Caruso move, and heard the unmistakable metallic sound of a weapon being drawn, and felt the specific quality of air that happens when a room full of people has stopped breathing simultaneously. Dante's hand found her arm in the dark. His grip was firm and directional, not holding her still, pointing her toward the door, moving her before she'd decided to move. Stay with me, he said. very low, directly into her ear. Don't stop. Don't let go. She didn't let go. They moved into the dark corridor with Caruso behind them, and somewhere above, deeper in the house, she heard glass and then voices, and then the sound that she had heard on the terrace and recognized now as something she would learn to identify quickly over the coming days. The sound of a situation coming apart, of whatever had been held together by structure and controlled space, and the management of information suddenly losing its management. The code had been changed 4 days ago. Only 6 people had it. One of them was in this corridor right now. She didn't know which one, and neither did Dante, and the darkness was complete, and she was in borrowed shoes in her sister's wedding dress, moving through the underside of a house she didn't know yet, following a man she'd married 3 hours ago under a false name, toward whatever was waiting at the other end of a very long night that was nowhere close to finished. And beneath all of it, beneath the adrenaline and the fear and the exhaustion and the fragments of memory still breaking loose from wherever they'd been sealed, beneath all of it was something else now. Something she hadn't felt since she'd walked into the chapel. Certainty. Not safety. Not hope. Not anything so comfortable as that. Just the bone-deep certainty that this was not something she was going to walk away from, and not something she was going to be carried through, and not something she was going to survive by staying still and locking doors and waiting for men with better information than hers to decide what happened to her next. She was in it. She had been in it for 20 years without knowing. Now she knew. The corridor turned and Dante stopped, and she felt him go completely still against her arm, and she stopped too. And in the absolute dark she heard, from the other side of the wall beside them, the sound of a careful, deliberate footstep. Then another, moving in the same direction they were. Caruso's hand came to her other shoulder from behind. 3 people in a narrow space, none of them breathing, all of them listening to the sound of someone who had known where they would be moving through the dark like they'd been given a map. Dante released her arm. She heard him shift his weight and understood without being told that he was repositioning, not retreating, repositioning, the difference being the direction you face when you do it. She pressed herself flat against the wall on her side of the corridor and made herself as small as a woman in a structured wedding gown could make herself and breathed through her mouth in long, controlled pulls. The footsteps on the other side of the wall slowed, stopped. Silence for 4 full seconds. Then they started again, moving faster now, as though whoever was on the other side had heard something or decided something and was done being careful about it. Dante said one word, very quiet, aimed at Caruso. East. Caruso moved past her in the dark. She felt the displacement of air, the solidity of him brushing her shoulder. And then there was a door opening somewhere ahead, a thin blade of emergency lighting cutting briefly into the corridor, and she saw Dante's profile for 1 second before the door shut again and the dark returned. He was looking back at her. "Move," he said. She moved. The east stairwell had a battery emergency strip along the baseboard that put out just enough light to see the edges of the stairs, but not the faces of the people using them. They went up 2 floors and came out into a wide hallway that she recognized from earlier in the evening. The guest wing, still and overlit now, with the regular power out, the emergency panels throwing everything into orange-tinted shadow. The sounds from below were louder up here. She could distinguish at least 3 separate sets of running feet, and at least one voice raised past professional restraint. Dante stopped at a door 2/3 down the hall, unlocked it with a key from his jacket, pushed it open. It was a bedroom, large, impersonal, clearly not the room he used himself. He moved to the window, checked the angle, apparently found it acceptable. "Sit," he said. "I'll stand." He turned and looked at her, and for the first time she saw frustration cross his face. Real frustration, not managed. "You've been useful tonight. You've kept your head, and you haven't slowed me down, and I mean that sincerely. Sit down before your legs give out, and I have to explain to Caruso why I let you go this long without making you stop." Her legs were, in fact, shaking. She sat on the edge of the bed. He moved to the door, opened it an inch, listened. "Who is it?" she said. "Inside the house. You know, don't you?" "I have a theory." "That's not an answer." "My theories have a way of being correct," he said, "and I'd prefer to be certain before I say it out loud, because once I say it, I have to act on it. She understood that. The weight of knowing a name before you were ready to use it. Petra, she said. He was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. She's been here 11 years, she said. You said you trusted her with 90%. The 10% you held back, she noticed the 10%. Long enough, you notice the edges of what you're not being told. You don't know her. I know people who work very hard inside systems that don't fully trust them, Avery said. The resentment has a specific shape. How long has she known she was in the 90 and not the 100? Dante turned from the door and looked at her across the dim room, and she could not read his expression clearly in the low light, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself against something. Long enough, he said finally. The confirmation sat between them, quiet and heavy. Then his phone lit in his jacket. He read the screen and everything in his face closed down at once. The tension, the fractional openness of the last few minutes, all of it gone, replaced by the controlled flatness she'd first seen at the altar. He turned the screen toward her. The message was 4 words, sent from a number she didn't recognize, the kind of number that existed for one use and would be gone within the hour. We have your sister. Talk. Avery stared at the screen until the display dimmed. Lena, who had run 3 hours before the ceremony with the man she loved, who had written 7 lines of apology and left her twin to walk into a marriage built on 20 years of buried evidence and suppressed memory and a dead man's pocket watch. Lena, who had nothing to do with any of it, and everything to do with all of it, because she had run at exactly the right moment to put Avery in that chapel, which meant someone had known she would run, which meant Lena had been watched, which meant the trap had been set not for Lena at all. It had been set for Avery. And Lena had walked into it anyway by leaving. She looked up at Dante. How long have they had her? She said. I don't know. Is she alive? They sent the message, which means they need something in return. Which means yes. He held her gaze. For now. The 2 words landed like stones. She stood up. The shaking in her legs had stopped, replaced by something steadier and colder and considerably more dangerous. Then we don't talk, she said. We move. Dante looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she understood he was recalculating something, adjusting some assessment he'd been running on her since before she'd walked down the aisle. Whatever he found in her face, it appeared to satisfy the calculation. We move, he agreed. And the night, which had already taken everything she'd thought she understood about her own life, opened into something she couldn't see the end of yet, only the shape of it, vast and unlit, and the certainty that she was walking into it with no way back. They found Petra in the kitchen, not hiding, not running, sitting at the long prep table in the back of the estate kitchen with a cup of tea in front of her that had gone cold, her hands folded around it in the way of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the stillness on the other side of it. The kitchen staff had been cleared out. Caruso's doing, 30 minutes prior, a precaution that now read as something else entirely. The overhead lights were back, the generator having kicked in sometime during their descent, and the fluorescence made everything look clinical and slightly wrong, the way familiar spaces look when the context around them has shifted. Petra looked up when they came in. She was 53, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular composure of someone who had managed complex logistics in a dangerous household for over a decade and understood that composure was the primary job requirement. Avery had spoken to her twice during the reception, brief exchanges about timing and room arrangements. She had seemed efficient. She had seemed loyal in the unremarkable way of people who had simply been somewhere long enough that loyalty had become indistinguishable from habit. She looked at Dante now with an expression Avery couldn't immediately name. Not fear, not defiance, something in between. The face of a person who has decided that whatever comes next, the deciding is done. Dante pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He did not look at Caruso. He did not look at Avery. He looked at Petra, and he said nothing, which turned out to be more effective than anything he could have said, because the silence required filling, and Petra filled it. I didn't know they'd take the girl, she said. Her voice was even. That wasn't part of what I agreed to. What did you agree to? Dante said. Access. Information on movement, on the timing of the marriage, Nothing operational. She paused. I want you to know that. What I know, Dante said, is that you gave them the door code. I gave them confirmation that she was coming, not Lena. Her. She glanced at Avery briefly. Not with hostility, with something more complicated than that. I didn't know what they'd do with it. You've worked in this house for 11 years, Dante said. You've watched what information does when it reaches certain people. You know exactly what they'd do with it. Petra's jaw tightened. The composure held, but Avery could see the effort it was taking now, the way you can see a structure bearing more weight than it was built for. Nothing visible on the surface, but something in the lines of it. How long? Dante said. 4 months. From the beginning. From when I started moving the engagement forward. Yes. Who approached you? A man named Calloway. He said he worked for a development firm. He knew things about my brother's situation that... She stopped, pressed her lips together. My brother has debt, the kind that doesn't get restructured. They had bought it. Calloway told me it would be forgiven in exchange for information on the Moretti household's movement and planning. Caruso made a sound from the doorway. Avery didn't look at him. Calloway is a Hale intermediary, Dante said. It wasn't a question. I didn't know that when I agreed. Something moved in Petra's face, not quite cracking, but close. I found out later. By then they had 3 months of information, and I was in it far enough that stopping felt... She exhaled. I told myself it was small, administrative things, nothing that would get anyone hurt. And when you realized it wasn't small, Petra looked at her cold tea. I kept going, because my brother's debt was almost cleared, and because I was afraid. She said the last word without softening it, which Avery found, despite everything, to be the most honest thing anyone had said in the last several hours. I was afraid, and I chose my family over yours. I know what that is. Dante was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen hummed around them, refrigeration units, the distant sound of the generator, the particular dense silence of a large house with most of its people cleared out of it. Where are they holding the girl? He said. I don't know. I was never given operational locations. Calloway's contact method. A phone, prepaid. He contacts me. She paused. They contacted me 40 minutes ago. They want a meeting. Tomorrow, noon, the waterfront development on Secker Point. The site Hale's firm has been building on for 2 years. She looked at Dante steadily. They want her. She meant Avery. In exchange for the sister. The words went into the room and settled there. Avery felt Dante's attention shift toward her without him moving. She didn't look at him. She was looking at Petra, at the architecture of a person who had made a bad choice inside a genuinely bad situation and had now arrived at the moment where all the choices narrowed to one corridor. Does Calloway know you're sitting here right now? Avery said. Petra looked at her. No. Then you still have a position, Avery said. You can still make contact. You can still confirm the meeting. Dante turned his head toward her. She felt it. Avery, she's the only line we have into Hale's operation tonight, Avery said, still looking at Petra. If we cut it, we lose the meeting location, we lose the timeline, and we lose any chance of walking into Secker Point on our terms instead of theirs. She paused. I'm not saying trust her. I'm saying use what's still usable. The kitchen was very still. Petra stared at Avery with an expression that was harder to read than anything she'd shown Dante. A kind of raw assessment, one damaged person looking at another and trying to determine the angle. Why would you argue for that? Petra said. Because my sister is somewhere in this city, and I don't have time for anything that isn't useful, Avery said. Dante looked at Petra for another long moment. Then he stood. Caruso will stay with you. You'll make contact with Calloway in the next 2 hours and confirm the meeting. You'll give him nothing else. He picked up the cold cup of tea and moved it to the counter, a small, precise gesture that seemed to close something. When this is over, you're done here. Your brother's debt, I'll handle myself. That's not contingent on anything. It's just done. But you're finished in this house. Petra nodded once. She looked older than she had 20 minutes ago. They left her in the kitchen with Caruso and moved back through the house toward the study, and in the hallway, Dante stopped and turned to Avery and said very quietly, You understand that the meeting is a trap. Of course it's a trap, she said. That's why we're going." He looked at her for a moment that had a particular quality to it, the look of someone revising an estimate upward, something shifting in the calculation. Then he turned and kept moving, and she followed him, and neither of them said anything else about it. The study had been disturbed in their absence, not ransacked, disturbed, carefully, the kind of disturbance that happens when someone has moved through a space quickly looking for something specific and hasn't found it. Two of the filing cabinet drawers were slightly open. A section of the corkboard had been touched. She could see it in the pins. Two of them shifted from their original positions. Dante saw it when he walked in and stopped in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds before moving to the desk and checking the drawer. Whatever he was checking for was still there. He exhaled once, barely audible. "They were in here," Avery said. "Someone was. During the blackout." He moved to the corkboard and examined the disturbed pins. They were looking at the Eastfield documentation. Did they find what they wanted? "The primary file isn't on this board. It's not in this room." He turned. "But they don't know that." He paused. "Which means they think they missed it, which means they'll try again." She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the board and felt the fragments of memory from earlier. The rain, the burning, the small weight in her palm, pressing closer, more insistent, like something trying to surface through ice. The watch, the key inside it. 20 years in a location she couldn't reach yet because whatever had been done to her memory had been done thoroughly, and the door wasn't opening on schedule. "I need to remember where I put it," she said. "I know. I need to remember tonight, before tomorrow. I know." He came and stood beside her, not close, not touching, but present in the way he'd been present since the corridor. A kind of directional gravity, like standing near something that generates its own weather. "Walk me through what you have. Everything, in order, no matter how small." She closed her eyes. Rain first. Always rain. The smell of it on warm stone before it gets cold, that brief window in early spring when a sudden rain hits pavement that's been collecting heat for weeks, and the smell is almost alive. She'd been cold. She remembered being cold and annoyed about it in the way children are annoyed when weather interrupts something they were supposed to be doing. She'd been with someone. An adult. Not her parents. Her parents had been somewhere else that day. She could feel the absence of them. The specific texture of a day when the adult responsible for you is not one of the adults who love you unconditionally. A family friend. A man. She reached for his face and found the outline of it, but not the features. Broad, pale. The kind of face she'd seen 1,000 times in the background of her childhood and never examined closely enough to retain. "There was a man with me," she said. "Not family. Someone my father knew through work. Do you have a name?" "Not yet." She kept her eyes closed. "We were on Merchant Street. I know that now. I can see the corner sign, but I didn't know the street name then. We'd stopped. He told me to wait by a wall while he talked to someone. I remember the wall because there was a crack in it I kept picking at with my fingernail." "Who was he talking to?" "I couldn't see clearly. I wasn't supposed to be watching." She pressed into it. The crack in the wall. The cold. The sound of voices, low and urgent, the frequency of adult conversation that children learn to decode as "this is serious and not for you." The other man had something in his hand. Small. Silver. He was showing it to the man with me, and the man with me was shaking his head. He didn't want to take it. There was an argument. And then the memory jumped. The way certain memories jump. Not a fade, a cut, like film with frames missing. She was on the ground. The noise was enormous. Heat on her face and the taste of something metallic. And her coat was wet and heavy, and her ears were producing a single flat tone that wasn't quite sound. The two men were gone from where they'd been standing. The street was different. The configuration of people, all of it reorganized by force into something she didn't have the framework to process. And in her hand. "I had it when I woke up," she said. "I was on the ground, and I had it in my hand. I must have grabbed it when they were arguing, or when everything—" She opened her eyes. "I took it because I thought it was pretty. I was 7. I thought it was pretty, and I put it in my pocket before anyone could see." "Where did you go after?" "That night. Immediately after." She worked at it. The memory had a wall at the end of it, not natural forgetting, a constructed wall built from the specific quality of psychological suppression that happens when a trauma is handled wrong in childhood, when well-meaning or not well-meaning adults tell a child that what they saw didn't happen or doesn't matter or is best forgotten. She could feel the construction of it. She could feel the edges. "Someone took me," she said slowly. "Not police, not emergency services. Someone who knew me, or knew my father, who came and took me away before the official response arrived." She stopped. The shape of a car, dark interior, a voice in the front seat that she'd heard before. "He put me in a car." "The man who was with you?" "No." She frowned. "No, he didn't come back. Someone else. Someone who arrived very quickly, too quickly, like they'd been nearby." She pressed hard at the wall and felt it hold and then felt it give just slightly, a hairline fracture in the construction, and through it came, "Calloway," she said. The name came out of her mouth before she understood it, and the understanding followed half a second behind like a shockwave chasing the initial impact. Dante went absolutely still. "What?" he said. "The man who put me in the car, who took me away from the street before anyone official arrived." She turned and looked at Dante and felt the floor of the situation drop away beneath her. It was Calloway, the same man who's been running Petra. He was there. He was there that night, and he took me and he drove me to... She stopped. Her hands had come up without her deciding to, pressing against the sides of her face, because the memory was opening now, and it was opening all at once rather than in pieces, and it was too much material arriving too fast. "He took me to a house on the east side. I don't know the address, but I know the house. I'd know it. And he took the coat. He told me we were going to wash it because it was dirty from falling, and he took the coat and..." She stopped. The coat. The watch in the pocket of the coat. "He has it," she said. "He took the coat, and he didn't know about the watch, and he's had it for 20 years without knowing what was in it." She looked at Dante and felt the specific, nauseating combination of revelation and loss that comes when the thing you've been looking for turns out to have been somewhere impossible all along. "Calloway has the watch." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Dante moved to the desk and sat down, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him do something that wasn't controlled. He pressed his fist against the surface of the desk once, briefly, not hard enough to make a sound, just the physical expression of 20 years of near proximity to a truth that had kept moving. Then he straightened and the control came back and he was looking at her with clear, cold eyes. "He doesn't know what he has," she said again. "Or he does, and he's been holding it as insurance," Dante said. "Against Hale, against anyone. A man in Calloway's position, middleman, perpetually expendable, having the one piece of evidence that can destroy his employer is a significant kind of life insurance. Either way, he'll have it at the meeting tomorrow. He may have it at the meeting tomorrow. We don't know that he'll have it," she said, "because he's bringing me to Hale as the last witness. And if he's smart, and he's survived 20 years in Hale's orbit, so he's smart, he won't hand over something that valuable without being in the room where it pays out." She was working through it as she spoke, the logic of it assembling itself from the architecture of everything she'd learned in the past several hours. He's been sitting on it, waiting for the moment when the witness and the evidence could be traded simultaneously for the maximum value. Dante looked at her for a long moment. "You're describing a man who's been planning to sell you to Hale since the moment you were old enough to remember." She heard it. She let it sit. "Yes," she said. "And your sister is currently with people who work for Calloway, which means her safety is contingent on Calloway's continued goodwill, which is contingent on us not moving against him before the meeting." "Yes." "Which means tomorrow at noon we walk onto a Hale construction site with no operational advantage, into a meeting that has been designed as a delivery mechanism for exactly one outcome." She looked at him. "Unless we change what gets delivered," she said. The words hung in the air of the study, and Dante looked at her across the desk and the corkboard and 20 years of evidence, and she could see him working through it, the angles, the risks, the margin for error in a plan that had no room for any. And she waited, because she had said everything she had to say, and now it was his calculation to make. But the decision forming behind his eyes, as the silence stretched, was not the one she'd expected. Because before he could speak, his phone lit again. He looked at the screen, and this time he didn't show it to her. He read it and set it face down on the desk with a deliberateness that was worse than any expression, and when he looked up, she knew from the quality of his stillness that whatever the message contained had changed the shape of everything they'd just been building. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a moment that felt like standing at the edge of something. "Lena isn't with Calloway's people," he said. "What do you mean?" "The message was from my federal contact. He's been running surveillance on the Secker Point site for 6 weeks as part of his parallel case." Dante's voice was very flat now, the particular flatness of someone delivering information they've already processed past the first wave of reaction. "Lena was brought to Secker Point 4 hours ago, before the wedding, before the shot on the terrace." He paused, before Petra made contact to confirm the meeting. The implications moved through her in sequence, each one worse than the last. "She was taken before anyone knew I'd be here," Avery said. "Yes." "Which means it wasn't leverage. It wasn't to use against me at the meeting." She felt her voice going very level, the way voices go when the mind is processing something that the body hasn't caught up with yet. "They took her before they even knew I existed in this context." "It means Hale knew about the switch before tonight," Dante said. "Not from Petra. From something else, something earlier. It means he's been several moves ahead of every calculation I've made." He stopped. "And it means that whoever gave him that information is not someone I've identified yet." The room tilted slightly, or felt like it did. She stood in Dante Moretti's study at 2 a.m. in her sister's wedding dress, with the weight of a 20-year-old conspiracy pressing down through the ceiling and the floor and every wall, and she understood finally, completely, with the clarity that only comes when all the comfortable uncertainties have been stripped away, that Dante had not in fact been in control of this situation at any point tonight. He'd thought he had been. He'd planned for Petra, and planned for the meeting, and planned for her memory returning on a manageable timeline, and he'd built a structure around all of it that was supposed to hold. The structure had been compromised before it was built, and her sister had been inside enemy territory for 4 hours, while Avery had been standing in a chapel and a study and a dark corridor, believing she was walking into danger with the right man beside her and a plan at her back. She looked at Dante. "Who else knew?" she said. "Before tonight. Who else knew I was coming instead of Lena?" "I told you, 3 people. You told me 3 people you knew of." She held his gaze and felt something in herself that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was entirely composed of the cold, structural recognition that trust, in this situation, was not something she could afford to extend to anyone on the basis of 11 years or 22 years, or any number of years at all. Who else could have known? Think. He held her gaze, and she watched him go through it, and she watched the moment he hit the answer, because she saw it. A small, contained movement behind his eyes, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for exactly that. "There's one person," he said slowly, "who would have had access to the contingency planning without being told directly. Who has been in this house long enough to understand how decisions get made without being in the room when they're made." He stopped. "Say it," she said. "The man who raised me after my father died," Dante said. "Who has been the operational foundation of this family for longer than I've been running it." His voice was completely flat now, carrying something that had no name she could put to it. "Who recommended Petra for her position 11 years ago?" The silence in the room was total. She watched Dante absorb the thing he'd just said, watched it move through him the way catastrophic knowledge moves through a person who has built their entire architecture of survival on a foundation that has just proven to be something else entirely. "Caruso," she said. And Dante said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. And somewhere in the house below them, Caruso was sitting in the kitchen with Petra, with access to the estate's remaining security infrastructure, with 11 years of Dante's operational knowledge in his head, and with a phone that could reach Vincent Hale in under 30 seconds. Dante moved first, not toward the door, toward the desk, the bottom drawer, the one he'd unlocked twice tonight already, and this time what he pulled out was not a photograph. It was a weapon, compact and dark, which he checked with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom the motion was as unremarkable as checking a wristwatch. He set it on the desk surface and looked at Avery. There's a car in the lower garage, he said, independent of the estate's main vehicle log. Key is behind the third panel on the left wall going down. You take it, and you drive north, and you do not stop until— No, she said. Avery. My sister is on that site right now. Tonight. Not tomorrow at noon, Tiais. Tonight while we're standing here. She moved to the desk and picked up the weapon before he could reach for it, and the weight of it in her hand was foreign and significant, and she held it anyway. Show me how this works. He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of a door closing. Then he came around the desk and stood beside her and showed her, efficiently and without commentary, the safety and the grip and the distance at which accuracy was reasonable for someone who had never fired one before. His hands over hers were impersonal and precise, and she paid attention to every word because her life had become the kind of situation where paying attention to every word was the minimum requirement for continuing to have one. Caruso, she said when he finished. How do we get past Caruso? We don't get past him, Dante said. We go through him. Something moved in his jaw. He's in the kitchen. One exit from that room that doesn't involve the main corridor. He's armed. Always. And he'll know the moment you're not where you're supposed to be. He already knows. He's been tracking my position in this house for 22 years. It's his job. He paused. Which means he's already made calculations about the next 40 minutes. Which means we have less time than I'd prefer. He picked up his own weapon from the desk and moved toward the study door and stopped. Stay close. Don't speak unless I address you directly. And whatever you see in that kitchen, I know, she said. He looked at her. You don't know, he said quietly. You haven't seen me do this. She met his gaze and held it. Then I'll learn fast. They went down. The kitchen corridor was lit and empty, which was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that meant immediate physical threat, but the procedural wrongness of a space that should have contained a specific person and didn't. Dante felt it before he saw it. She could tell by the way his pace changed, a fractional adjustment in his stride, weight shifting forward. He pushed the kitchen door open with his shoulder and led with the weapon, and there was no one there. The teacup was still on the prep table. The chairs were pushed back in the particular configuration of people leaving in a hurry rather than a planned departure. The door to the service corridor at the far end was standing open an inch, not latched. He's gone, Avery said. He took her with him. Dante was already moving toward the service corridor door, checking the angle before he went through. Which means he knows I worked it out. He's been watching the study feed. There are cameras in the study? There are cameras everywhere in this house, he said, and the way he said it contained 22 years of a specific kind of betrayal compressed into a single sentence. I knew about most of them. He installed the others. They went through the service corridor and down to the lower garage, and the car Dante had described was there. A dark sedan, clean, no plates visible, the kind of vehicle that had been prepared for exactly this kind of departure. But what was also there, standing between them and the car with his arms at his sides and his face carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something heavy for a very long time, was Caruso. Petra was not with him. The garage was low-ceilinged and smelled of concrete and oil and the cold that accumulates in underground spaces regardless of season. 2 fluorescent strips overhead, one of them flickering at irregular intervals that threw the shadows in unpredictable directions. Dante stopped 6 feet from Caruso, and Avery stopped behind and to his left, and the 3 of them occupied the space in a configuration that had no comfortable resolution. Where is she? Dante said. Safe. Caruso's voice was what it always was, gravel and metal, but there was something under it now that hadn't been audible before, or that she hadn't known to listen for. She's not part of this, Dante. I made sure. You made sure. Dante's voice was very controlled. The control was the most frightening thing in the room. You've been feeding information to Hale's operation for how long? Caruso looked at him for a long moment. He looked, Avery thought, like a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times and had not found a version of it that felt acceptable. 3 years, Caruso said. 3 years. Something flickered in Dante's face and was gone. Since I started building the federal case. Since you started building something that was going to get you killed. Caruso's voice went rougher, something cracking through the gravel. You want to know what I've been doing for 22 years? I've been keeping you alive. You were 15 when your father died. 15. I held this family together with... I made decisions that kept you breathing until you were old enough to make your own, and then I watched you spend the next decade building a case against a man who has buried every person who's ever come at him directly. He stopped. I gave Hale enough to keep him satisfied. I kept you far enough back from the edge that he never felt threatened enough to move on you. You gave him the witness locations, Dante said. The words were very flat. The families that were destroyed in the secondary purge, 3 years ago, when I thought we'd finally identified everyone who'd survived Eastfield, and I gave you the list so you could arrange protection. You gave him the list. The kitchen silence was nothing compared to this. Caruso's face didn't change. It didn't need to. The answer was in the stillness. They were already compromised, Caruso said. Hale already had 2 of the names. I gave him the others because if I didn't, he'd have known I was running a double, and you'd have been next on the list instead. You chose, Dante said. I chose you. Caruso said it without apology and without softness. Every time. For 22 years. That's what I chose. The fluorescent strip flickered. In the stuttering light, Dante looked like something carved, all the human variability stripped out of his face, replaced by something older and more absolute. And the girl, Dante said, her family, 8 years of systematic financial destruction. You knew. I knew. She was 7 years old in that street. I know how old she was. For the first time, something moved in Caruso's face. Not guilt exactly, nothing so clean as that, something more complicated and more painful, the expression of a man who has justified the same thing to himself so many times that the justification has worn through, and what's left underneath is just the thing itself, unadorned. She was a loose end that Hale wanted cleaned up. I managed how he cleaned it. I kept it to the finances. I kept it to the family assets. I kept him from... From what? Avery said. Caruso looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked directly at her since they'd come into the garage. From sending someone to the house when you were 12, he said. When you started having the nightmares again, and your mother mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else. I rerouted that. I told Hale the girl had no coherent memory, that she was seeing a therapist and being managed, that moving on her would create more attention than it resolved. He paused. I bought you years. I'm not asking you to thank me for it. The fluorescent light steadied. In the even light, Avery looked at the broad, broken-nosed face of a man who had spent 22 years making choices in the dark and calling them protection, and felt something that was not forgiveness and not rage, but was something in the territory between them. The recognition of a person who did terrible things for reasons that were not entirely without logic, which was somehow worse than simple malice. Petra, she said. Where is she? East Wing. Room she uses when she stays over. She's not going anywhere. She made her decision and she knows it. He paused. She didn't know about the full scope. She thought she was feeding scheduling information to a development competitor. I used her the same way Calloway did. Dante raised his weapon. The motion was smooth and entirely without theater, and Caruso looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been expecting for a long time and has decided not to run from. Dante, Caruso said. Secker Point, Dante said. Full layout. Current security deployment. Where they're holding Lena and how many people are between her and the exit. A pause. You're going tonight. Full layout, Caruso. Now. Another pause, longer, the kind that contains an enormous internal negotiation conducted at speed. Then Caruso reached slowly into his jacket and produced his phone and held it out, screen-facing Dante. It's all on there, he said. 3 years of documentation, Hale's site deployment, the financial network map, the internal communication logs. He held Dante's gaze. I've been building it, in case I ever needed it, in case you ever needed it. He didn't look away. I told you, every time. I chose you. Dante took the phone. The moment after he took it was the longest moment in the garage. Avery did not breathe. Caruso did not move. Dante looked at the screen for 10 seconds that felt considerably longer, and whatever he saw there, Whatever 3 years of parallel documentation looked like when you were simultaneously the person it was meant to protect and the person it had been built on the wreckage of, moved through him in a way she couldn't fully read. He lowered the weapon. "Get out of this city," Dante said. "Tonight. Don't come back." Caruso looked at him for a moment. Something moved in the older man's face that she would think about later, but not relief, not gratitude, something rawer than both of those. The expression of a man being handed something he knew he hadn't earned. He moved past them toward the far end of the garage and the door there, and his footsteps were heavy on the concrete, and he didn't look back, and then he was gone, and the door settled shut, and the garage was quiet. Dante stood with the weapon at his side and Caruso's phone in his other hand and breathed, once, controlled, through his nose. Then he moved to the car. Secker Point was 40 minutes north of the estate on a route that bypassed the main arterials, a waterfront development site that Hale's construction firm had been building on for 2 years. A mixed-use complex that existed primarily as a legal vehicle for the financial network running underneath it. A series of shell structures that would never be fully completed because completion would require inspections, and inspections required paper trails that Hale had spent considerable effort ensuring never materialized. At 11:47 at night, the site was not empty. Dante had killed the headlights 3 blocks out and navigated the last stretch on the ambient light from the construction towers, which stayed lit through the night for security purposes and threw a pale industrial glow across everything that made it look like the surface of something not quite habitable. He pulled the car between 2 equipment containers and cut the engine, and they sat for a moment in the ticking silence. 4 entry points, he said, eyes on the site through the windshield. 2 are watched, main gate and the eastern loading dock. The north access is a fence gap that the construction crew uses and that Hale's security knows about but monitors rather than closes because closing it would require acknowledging they know about it. He tapped Caruso's phone screen. According to this, Lena is in the site office on the 3rd level of the central structure. 2 guards on the door, 1 on the stairwell landing below, 1 on the exterior. And Hale. Not on site yet. He paused. The meeting tomorrow was always Calloway's arrangement. Hale wouldn't come himself until the exchange was confirmed. Another pause. Calloway is on site, 2nd level office. The watch, she said. If he has it, it'll be on him. Calloway doesn't leave assets unsecured anywhere he isn't. She looked at the site through the windshield and felt the weapon in her jacket pocket and the specific quality of fear that she was learning to distinguish from panic, not the kind that freezes, the kind that sharpens, that takes everything unnecessary out of the picture and leaves only what matters, outlined hard and clear. We split, she said. No. You go for Calloway. I go for Lena. She turned and looked at him. You know the security deployment. You know how to move through that site. I don't. I'll slow you down going after him, but I know my sister. I know how to get her moving fast and quiet, and I know how to keep her from falling apart in the middle of a construction site at midnight. You've never done anything like this. 3 hours ago, I'd never been married to a crime boss either. She held his gaze. I adapt. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing it. The real risk calculation, not the protective instinct, but the tactical reality, which was that she was right, and he knew she was right, and they both knew that the reason he was hesitating was not strategic. The north fence gap, he said. 10 meters in, there's a construction lift on the right. Stairwell is behind it. 3rd level, turn left. The office is the 2nd door. The guards rotate every 20 minutes. Caruso's data shows the last rotation was 11:30, which gives us a window before 11:50. He looked at the clock on the dash. It read 11:42. 8 minutes. Then stop talking, she said, and opened the door. The night air was cold and smelled of salt water and concrete dust, and somewhere further into the site, diesel fuel from a generator that was running something she couldn't see. She moved along the fence line with Dante 2 steps ahead, checking angles, his body language entirely different from how it had been in the house. Looser, more economical. The controlled stillness replaced by the controlled movement of someone who had done this kind of work before and whose body remembered it more fluently than conscious thought. The fence gap was where Caruso's data said it would be, a section of chain link that had been bent back at the base and weighted with a concrete block to keep it open. the specific maintenance of a passage that many people use and no one officially acknowledges. Dante went through and she followed, and they were on the site. The ground was churned and uneven, construction debris distributed at shin level everywhere, the kind of terrain that punished inattention. She kept her eyes down and forward in alternation and her hand on the weapon in her pocket, and did not think about anything except the distance between herself and the lift, and the stairwell, and the stairwell, and the second door on the left. They separated without speaking at the base of the central structure. Dante toward the interior corridor that led to the second-level offices, and Avery toward the stairwell. She watched him go and then turned and went up. The stairwell was open-sided, a temporary construction staircase with metal mesh treads that rang slightly with each step regardless of how carefully she placed her feet. She went up as lightly as she could and tried to put the sound out of her mind and concentrated on the landing above and whether the guard on the stairwell had a line of sight down. He did. She saw his boots first on the edge of the landing, a man sitting on a folding chair leaning back slightly, the particular posture of someone doing a night watch in the middle of a shift when nothing has happened and the body's vigilance has downgraded itself accordingly. He was looking at his phone. The screen lit his face from below. She had 8 steps remaining between her position and the landing. She took them one at a time, 15 seconds per step, weight distributed across the full tread to spread the sound, and she did not look at anything except his boots and the angle of his head and the moment when he would look up. He didn't look up. She came onto the landing behind him and put the weapon against the back of his neck and said, very quietly, "Don't." He went completely still. The phone screen showed a game of some kind, colorful and mundane, entirely unrelated to where he was and what he was doing. "Put the phone down," she said, both hands on the railing. He did both things slowly. His hands on the railing were large and he was much bigger than her, and they were both aware of this. "The office," she said. "How many inside?" A pause. She pressed the weapon slightly forward. "2," he said, low, resigned. "Calloway's guys, they're not going to let her go without—" "That's not your problem anymore," she said. "Stand up slowly and walk to the corner and sit down with your back to the wall and your hands visible." He did it. She watched him do it from the top of the stairs, and then turned and moved to the second door on the left and put her ear against it. She heard Lana before she opened the door. Not speaking, just the particular quality of someone else's breathing, quick and shallow. The breathing of a person who has been afraid for hours and is running low on the resource that keeps fear from becoming something worse. She opened the door. Lena was sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall, wrists zip-tied in front of her, hair destroyed, mascara halfway down her face, wearing the clothes she'd apparently run in. A jacket and jeans, as though she'd only meant to go around the block. The 2 men in the room turned simultaneously, and Avery leveled the weapon and said, "Down," with a conviction she was borrowing from somewhere she hadn't known she had. And one of them calculated the situation correctly and went to the floor, and the other calculated it incorrectly and moved toward her, and she did something she'd seen Dante do in the corridor. She moved sideways rather than back, which put his momentum past her, and she put the weapon against his kidney and said "floor" again, and this time he went. Lena was staring at her. "Avery," she said. Her voice was completely wrecked. "Can you stand?" Yes, I—" She got her feet under her and came upright, hands still bound. Avery crossed to her and got the zip tie and looked at it and looked around the room for anything with an edge and found a box cutter on the work table by the window and cut the tie and watched Lena's hands come free and shake. "We have to go right now," Avery said. "How? What is—" "Lena." She took her sister's face in both hands and held it, forced eye contact, felt the trembling running through her and the way the fear wanted to swamp everything else. "I need you to hold it together for 10 minutes. Can you do that?" Lena looked at her. Something steadied, fractionally, behind the terror. "Yes," she said. "Then let's move." They were through the door and to the stairwell in 30 seconds, and Avery checked the corner where she'd left the guard and found him where she'd put him, sitting, watching her with an expression she didn't have time to interpret. And she kept Lena close, and they went down the stairs and she was counting. Minutes, seconds, the rotation window Dante had given her, the distance to the fence gap, the location of the car. They were almost to the bottom of the stairwell when she heard it. Not the sound she'd been dreading, not gunfire, not alarm. A voice. Coming from the direction Dante had gone, a specific voice, carrying the easy authority of a man in a space he controls and the specific quality of it. Measured, pleasant, the voice of a person who has arranged things to his satisfaction and is enjoying the arrangement, turned her blood to something cold and purposeful. She knew the voice. She had not heard it before, but she knew it the way you know things that have been in the architecture of your life long enough to leave an impression in the structure. She stopped at the base of the stairs. "The stairwell goes to the fence," she said to Lena. 10 meters, turn right. There's a car between two equipment containers. Dark sedan. Get in, lock the doors, wait." She pressed the car key into her sister's bound hands. Lena stared at her. "Where are you?" "Dante went for Calloway," she said. "That voice is not Calloway." She looked at her sister. "Go, I mean it." Lena went. Avery turned and moved toward the voice. The second-level corridor was unfinished, raw drywall and exposed conduit, and a floor that was still bare concrete, and at the far end of it, in the open frame of what would eventually be a doorway, but was currently just a gap in the wall, two figures were visible in silhouette against the construction site lighting that came through the unglazed window behind them. Dante. And the man beside him, shorter by 4 inches, silver-haired, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's cars, holding nothing in his hands, which somehow made him more dangerous than if he'd been holding everything. Vincent Hale had come to the site himself, after all, and he was looking down the corridor at Avery with an expression she recognized from the photograph in Dante's study. The pleasant, arranged face of a man who has been told good news and is in the process of confirming it. "There she is," Hale said. Dante was very still. His weapon was not visible. She understood, with a precision that felt like cold water moving through her, that the stillness was not his choice, that in the 30 seconds between her heading for the stairwell and now, the situation in the corridor had been rearranged, and the man standing just outside her line of sight to Hale's left, whose presence she registered as a pressure change rather than a visual, was the reason Dante was standing the way he was standing. She stopped in the corridor, 40 feet between her and Hale, the weapon in her pocket, the watch, somewhere in this building, on Calloway's body, which meant Calloway was either in the room beyond that doorway or was no longer a factor, and either answer produced its own set of immediate problems. "You have better instincts than I expected," Hale said. "Walking in here without the negotiation. That's a Moretti trait, actually. Marco was the same. He said the name without particular weight, the casual brutality of a man for whom other people's losses are long ago data points. I've been looking for you for a long time, Avery." "I know," she said. He smiled. It was a real smile. That was the worst of it, the specific realness of it, the smile of a man who found his own situation genuinely satisfying. "Then you know how this resolves. The watch. Where it is. That's all I need from you. Everything else—" He gestured slightly, a small, elegant motion toward Dante. "Is secondary." She looked at Dante. He was looking at her. Not with the measuring quality of the altar or the study or the corridor. Something different. Something direct and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen in him before. As though the management had dropped just slightly, just enough. And what was underneath it was simply this. Whatever she decided to do, he would not try to control it. She put her hand in her pocket. Hale's attention sharpened. The man outside her sightline shifted. She pulled her hand out of her pocket. Not the weapon. The small black device from the desk drawer, the one with the red indicator light that had been off when she'd found it and had been sitting in her pocket since, pressed against her hip through 6 hours of a night that had dismantled everything she thought she understood about her own history. She held it up so Hale could see it. "The watch," she said, "is not the only copy of what's on it." The smile on Hale's face changed. Not gone. Changed. Recalculating, the pleasant arrangement of features shifting into something more careful. "That's a bluff," he said. "Dante," she said, "what does this do?" "A beat." "It's a transmitter," Dante said. His voice was completely level. "Paired to a server outside this building. Anything in its proximity that is actively broadcasting, any active encrypted signal in range. It strips the encryption and transmits the decrypted signal to the paired server in real time. She looked at Hale. "Calloway had the watch," she said. "Calloway is in this building. The watch contains an active encrypted microfilm reader. It's been readable since the technology to read it was developed, and Calloway has been reading it for 3 years as his insurance." She watched Hale's face very carefully. "Which means it's been broadcasting. Which means that device has been transmitting since I walked into this building." The corridor was absolutely still. "You're lying," Hale said, but the pleasant quality had entirely left his voice. "The server is operated by a federal contact," Dante said, "who has been waiting for physical documentation for 3 years, who has a standing judicial authorization to act on transmitted encrypted financial records matching the Eastfield network signature." He paused. "Who was notified the moment Avery entered this building." Hale looked at the device in her hand and then at Dante and then back at her, and she watched the calculation happen. The rapid, experienced processing of a man who had spent 20 years outmaneuvering every threat to his position, running the numbers on whether this was real, whether the transmitter was real, whether the server was real, whether any of it held up under the pressure of the next 60 seconds. She watched the moment he couldn't be certain. That was the moment. She pressed the button on the device, and the red indicator light came on and held steady, and in the corridor of an unfinished building at midnight, with her sister moving toward a dark car at the fence line, and Dante 3 feet from the man who had put a bullet in his father, and 20 years of collateral damage and everything that came after, the last piece of a 20-year architecture fell into place, not with violence, but with the single definitive sound of a connection being made. Hale moved, not toward her, away, back through the doorway, the survival instinct of a man whose entire empire had just been built on a foundation that was transmitting itself to a federal server, overriding 20 years of composed authority in a single second. He moved fast for a man his age, and the guard outside her sightline moved with him. And in the half-second that the pressure in the corridor redistributed, Dante moved too. He closed the 4 feet between himself and the guard, an emotion that had no wasted component, not a fight, a termination, the guard's weapon redirected and his balance broken, and the corridor wall doing the rest. The sound was sharp and brief, and then the guard was down and Dante had the weapon and was through the doorway after Hale. Avery ran. The room beyond the doorway was wide and unfinished, and lit by 2 construction lamps that threw hard shadows in opposing directions. And Calloway was there. On the floor, conscious, hands zip-tied behind him, a cut above his eyes suggesting the negotiation had not gone his way when Hale had arrived and found it no longer necessary. On the floor beside him, having fallen from his jacket, a silver pocket watch lay face up on the concrete. She crossed to it without breaking stride and picked it up and closed her fist around it and felt the weight of it. Small, cold, unremarkable, carrying 20 years of consequence in a cavity behind its face. Hale was at the far window. There was no exit there. Just the unglazed frame and the 3-story drop to the construction site below, and Dante was between him and the only door, and the pleasant composure was entirely gone now, stripped clean, and what was underneath it was just a man at the end of a very long calculation who had finally reached the wrong answer. "It's done," Dante said. Hale looked at him. He looked at Avery. He looked at the watch in her hand. "You can't prove—" "It's already transmitted," she said. "It's already there. Whatever happens in this room right now doesn't change what's already on that server." The construction lamps hummed. Somewhere outside, distant but closing, she heard the specific sound of vehicles moving fast on the access road. Not construction equipment, not Hale's people, something else entirely. The sound of a situation being arrived at by people who had been waiting for exactly this signal. Hale heard it too. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. It was barely visible, and it was complete. The specific physical grammar of a man who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has just been relieved of it by force. Dante lowered his weapon. "Get on the ground," he said. Not loudly, not with rage. With the flat, exhausted authority of a man closing an account that has been open for 20 years too long. Hale got on the ground, and the vehicles arrived. The federal vehicles were 3 black SUVs and a sedan, and they came through the main gate rather than the fence gap, which meant someone had called ahead or the site security had made a rapid calculation about which side of the situation was safer to be on. They arrived with no sirens, just the lights, cutting across the unfinished walls of the structure in long, sweeping arcs, blue and white, turning everything intermittently stark and then dim. Avery stood in the third-floor room with the watch in her fist and watched through the unglazed window as 6 men in federal gear moved across the site below with the efficient geometry of people who had rehearsed this specific deployment, and she felt the adrenaline begin its long recession. Not gone, not even close to gone, but pulling back from the immediate surface, leaving behind something raw and exhausted and slightly disoriented, the feeling of a body that has been operating at emergency capacity for 8 hours and is only now receiving permission to acknowledge it. Calloway was still on the floor. He'd gotten himself to a sitting position, back against the wall, wrists still bound, blood dried at his temple. He was looking at the watch in her hand with an expression she recognized. Not quite grief, not quite defeat. The specific look of a man watching something he'd been holding for 20 years finally leave his possession. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left in his face that wanted to say anything. 2 of the federal agents came through the doorway and took Hale. And Hale went without struggle, without speaking, and that was the most disturbing thing about it. The silence of a man who had already understood. Somewhere between the moment she'd pressed the button and the moment the vehicles arrived, that the architecture he'd spent 2 decades building had transmitted itself to the server that would dismantle it, and that nothing said in this room or any room going forward would change the foundation of what had already moved. A 3rd agent came for Calloway. Calloway looked at Avery as they brought him to his feet. She expected him to say something, some version of explanation, justification, the accounting that people reach for when there's nothing left to hold. He didn't. He looked at her for 3 seconds with the face of a man who had pulled a 7-year-old girl out of a burning street and driven her to safety and taken her coat and kept the thing inside it and spent 20 years living with the specific weight of all 3 of those facts simultaneously. Then he looked away and let the agent move him toward the door, and that was the end of it. Dante's federal contact was a man named Reeves. Compact, 40s. The kind of face that had been professionally neutral for so long it had become structurally neutral, the bones of it arranged for minimum information. He came into the room after the others and looked at Dante with the particular expression of 2 people who have been working toward the same point from different directions for long enough that arrival feels more like relief than victory. The transmission came through clean, Reeves said. Full financial record, 47 accounts, 19-year transaction history. The Eastfield network, the secondary acquisitions, 3 municipal contracts. He paused. It's enough. The families, Dante said. The asset recovery process starts tomorrow. Some of it is going to take time. The legal architecture Hale used was layered intentionally, and unwinding it is not a fast process. But the core criminal enterprise is done tonight. Reeves glanced at Avery. We're going to need a formal statement. The transmission is primary evidence, but a witness account of the recovered memory and the watch's chain of custody will close the gaps. Tomorrow, Dante said. Reeves looked at him for a moment. Tomorrow morning, he said, and left it there and moved toward the door and stopped. The transmitter device. Where did you get it? Dante looked at Avery. She opened her jacket pocket and produced the small black device and held it out to Reeves, who took it and turned it over in his hands and looked at the steady red indicator light. It's been on since she entered the building, Dante said. Everything in proximity. Reeves looked at the device for another moment. This is a prototype, he said slowly. It's not cleared for operational use. It's not supposed to be outside our facility. Interesting, Dante said. Reeves looked at him. He looked at the device. He put it in his jacket pocket and said nothing further and walked out, and Avery waited until his footsteps had faded down the stairwell before she turned to Dante. That was a television remote, she said. Dante looked at her. From the desk drawer, she said. It controls the secondary monitor input. I found it when I was looking through your desk and I put it in my pocket because it was small and I thought... She stopped. I didn't know what it was. I just held it up because I needed him to believe something for 30 seconds. The room was very quiet. You bluffed him, Dante said. The watch was already transmitting because Calloway had been actively accessing the microfilm reader. You said it yourself. He'd been reading it for 3 years as insurance. The server, the federal authorization, All of that was real. I needed Hale to believe the button mattered, so he'd freeze long enough for the vehicles to arrive. She looked at the window, at the blue and white light still moving across the site below. I didn't know if it would work. Dante was quiet for a long moment. It worked, he said. She exhaled. The exhaustion came in then fully, the wave of it, and she put her hand against the wall because the wall was there and solid. And she needed something solid for a moment. The watch was still in her other fist, and she opened her hand and looked at it. Silver, engraved on the case back with initials she could now read in the construction lamplight, worn slightly at the edges from 20 years of handling. Small, unremarkable. The kind of thing a 7-year-old picks up because it catches the light. She closed her hand around it again. They found Lena in the car. She had done exactly what Avery had told her, gotten in, locked the doors, waited, and she had been waiting for 41 minutes by the time Avery came through the fence gap and crossed to the sedan and knocked on the window. Lena unlocked the door and Avery got in the back, and Lena turned around from the front seat and looked at her sister in the way that people look at each other when something enormous has happened and there are no words that are proportionate to it yet. "Are you hurt?" Lena said. Her voice was still wrecked. "No." Avery looked at her sister's face, the mascara, the fear residue, the specific guilt that had been sitting in Lena's expression since she'd turned around, the guilt of someone who knows that their leaving set a chain of events in motion that they did not intend and cannot fully account for. "Are you?" "No." A pause. "Avery?" "Not now," Avery said, not harshly, just the plain truth of a person who did not have the reserves for that conversation at that moment. "Not tonight. We'll do it, but not tonight." Lena nodded. Her jaw worked briefly and then steadied. She turned back around and put her hands in her lap, and they sat together in the dark car while the federal lights moved across the site and the long machinery of consequence began its work. Dante came through the fence gap 20 minutes later and got in the driver's seat without speaking and drove them away from Secker Point, and none of the three of them said anything for a long time, which was its own kind of language. The language of people who have passed through something together and are still in the process of understanding what they passed through. The formal statement took 4 hours the following morning. Reeves ran it in a federal building downtown, a room with no windows and good coffee, and a recording system that Avery was aware of every moment she was talking. She gave them everything. The memory of Merchant Street, the watch, Calloway pulling her into the car, the coat, the years of not quite remembering that had lived in her as nightmares and inexplicable dread, and the particular ache of a history that had been taken out of her without her consent. She gave it all in order, clearly, without embellishment, and she did not cry, which surprised her slightly because she had expected to, and the not crying felt important in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. Like something in her had decided that the story deserved to be told steadily, given to the record without falling apart, because that was what the people it belonged to deserved. Dante sat outside during the statement. She had told him to. He was there when she came out, standing in the corridor with 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one and she took it, and they walked out of the building into the thin morning light of a city that looked exactly the way it always looked, and was nevertheless entirely different. Reeves says the asset recovery process will take 12 to 18 months, Dante said. The primary criminal case moves faster. Grand jury within 60 days, he thinks. The families, she said, the ones Hale destroyed. Reeves has a victim advocate team. They start outreach today. He was quiet for a moment. The Eastfield victims, the ones who died. There's a process for formal recognition, for putting their names back into the record the way they should have been 20 years ago. She nodded. She thought about Marco Moretti, 51 years old, standing in a street in the rain, knowing something was moving and sending his son away and not going himself. She didn't say anything about it because Dante was already carrying it and had been carrying it for 20 years, and the best thing she could do for it was not add weight to it. My family's debt, she said, handled, as of this morning. He said it the way he'd said it to Petra, not as a transaction, not as a gesture, just as a fact that had been resolved. Entirely. No conditions. She looked at him. That's not, you didn't have to, your family's financial situation was the result of a systematic attack orchestrated by a man I've been hunting for 2 decades. Clearing it is not generosity. He held her gaze. It's a debt I owe. She didn't argue with that. The logic of it was sound, and she was too tired to argue with sound logic. 3 days after Secker Point, Lena came to the estate. Avery had been staying in the guest wing, in the room where Dante had taken her during the blackout, the large, impersonal room with the window that looked over the grounds. And she had spent 3 days doing the slow, disorienting work of integrating everything she knew now into the framework of everything she'd understood before, which were so different from each other that the integration sometimes felt less like understanding and more like learning a new language for a life she'd already been living. She heard Lena's car on the gravel from the window and went downstairs. They stood in the estate's main hall, which was too grand a setting for what they needed to do and which they both ignored in favor of looking at each other. Lena looked better than she had in the car, cleaned up, rested in the superficial way of someone who has slept because the body demanded it rather than because the mind had quieted. She was holding herself with the particular careful posture of someone who is prepared to absorb a blow. "I should have told you about Marcus," she said. "I should have told you months ago. I kept thinking I'd find another way to fix it, that I'd find a way to—" She stopped. "I made you walk in there blind." "Yes," Avery said. Lena flinched slightly. She'd been expecting something more. More anger, more accusation, more of the architecture of the guilt she'd clearly been building for herself in the days since Secker Point. The plain yes disoriented her. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Avery said. "It's not fine. You left me a 7-line note, and I walked into a marriage on the back of it and found out my entire childhood was someone else's damage control." She looked at her sister. "I'm angry. I'll probably be angry about it for a while." "Okay," Lena said quietly, "but I also know that you didn't know what you were running from, that the situation you were in wasn't the situation you thought it was, and that what you did was make a desperate choice with the information you had." Avery looked at her. "We've both been doing that. We've been doing it our whole lives because someone decided a long time ago that we weren't allowed to have the full picture." Lena's eyes had gone wet. She was holding it back with some effort. "I didn't know about any of it," she said. "The explosion, the watch. I didn't know." "I know you didn't. I would never have, if I'd known what it would cost you to—" "Lena!" Avery stepped forward and put her arms around her sister and felt Lena's breath catch and then release, the long, shaky exhale of someone putting down something very heavy. "I know," she said. "I know." They stood in the grand hall of the Moretti estate for a long time, two sisters from a family that had been targeted and bled and used as a pressure point by a man who was now in federal custody. And the holding of it was not clean. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't forgiveness complete and uncomplicated. It was something more honest than that. The acknowledgement that damage is real and love is also real, and the two things exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. Her parents came 2 weeks later. Her father was smaller than she remembered, or she had grown into a different understanding of his size. The broad, confident man who had straightened his tie in the hallway mirror and told her that the only thing that couldn't be taken from them was their word. He looked at her in the entrance of the estate with an expression that was entirely undone. All the composure of a lifetime of presenting himself as someone in control stripped back to what was underneath, which was just a man who understood finally what his daughter had walked into and what it had cost her and what it had saved. He didn't say anything. He pulled her in and held on, and she let him, and she felt the 12-year-old and the 7-year-old and every version of herself between then and now present in that hold, all of them receiving something that had been interrupted and was now, imperfectly and belatedly, being completed. Her mother cried. Properly, with no attempt at management, which was so unlike her mother's usual composure that it became the most clarifying thing of all, the indicator of the true scale of what had been lifted, because her mother cried for the debt and the fear and the years of slow dismantling, and then stopped crying and looked around the estate and said, with typical asperity, that the East Wing needed better curtains, and Avery laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. The Eastfield victims were formally recognized 6 weeks after Hale's arrest. Not a ceremony. Reeves had offered one, and Dante had declined on behalf of the families, because a ceremony would have been for the public, and the public had not been owed 20 years of silence, the families had. Instead, there was a private acknowledgement in the federal record, each name entered with its correct context. The gas main narrative officially retracted and replaced with a finding of deliberate criminal action. It did not bring anyone back. It did not restore what had been taken in the years of living without truth. But it was a different kind of weight. The weight of a name that has been given back to itself, which is lighter than the weight of a name that has been erased. Dante stood in the records office when it was done and said nothing for a moment. And Avery stood beside him and watched his face and saw what 20 years of working toward something looks like when it arrives. Not triumph, nothing so loud as that. A settling. The specific quality of a man who has been braced against something for so long that the releasing of it requires a moment to simply feel the body's readjustment. He said very quietly, "His name is in the record." "Yes," she said. "That's enough," he said. And she understood that he meant it, not as resignation, not as the minimizing of what had been lost, but as the genuine assessment of a man who had learned over 20 years to understand what enough actually looked like versus what he'd wished it could be. In the months that followed, Dante began the process of restructuring the Moretti holdings. It was not fast, and it was not clean, and it was not the kind of transformation that announces itself with grand gestures. It happened in decisions, in contracts declined and contracts renegotiated, in the gradual reorientation of assets toward legitimate infrastructure, in conversations with people who had depended on the old structure and needed to understand that the old structure was over and that something else was being built in its place. Some of those conversations were difficult. Some of the people who depended on the old structure were not interested in what was being built in its place. Those people found other arrangements, and Dante let them go, and did not fill the space they left with equivalent compromises. Avery watched him do it. She was present for some of the conversations and absent for others, and she learned to read the difference between the decisions that required her perspective and the decisions that were his to make alone, which was one of the ongoing negotiations of a marriage that had started as something else and was slowly, stubbornly becoming what it had always been capable of being if the circumstances had allowed it. She gave her victim's statement in the criminal trial 6 months after Secker Point. The courtroom was full. Press, affected families, people whose connection to Hale's empire she would never fully know. She sat in the witness chair and answered the questions clearly and looked once at Hale across the room and found in herself no desire to perform anything for him, no visible anger, no fear, nothing that gave him a role in whatever she was feeling. He had had a role in her life for 20 years without her knowledge. He didn't get to have one now. The verdict came in on a Thursday afternoon in autumn. Guilty on all primary counts. The sentencing would take another 2 months, and the asset recovery would take another year, and the full legal unwinding of the network would take longer than that. But the verdict was the center of it, the moment when 20 years of buried truth became 20 years of proven fact, entered into the record, belonging to the record permanently and irrevocably. Avery was in the estate garden when Dante called her with the news. She was doing nothing important, sitting on the low stone wall at the garden's eastern edge with a cup of coffee, watching the late afternoon light move across the grounds. She answered, and he told her, and she said nothing for a moment, just held the phone and let it arrive. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," he said. She put the phone in her pocket and sat on the wall for another few minutes in the thin autumn light, and she thought about a yellow coat and a crack in a wall and the smell of spring rain on warm pavement and a small, cold weight in the palm of a 7-year-old hand. She thought about everything that had been built around that moment and everything that had been destroyed by it and everything that had, improbably, survived it. She thought about her father straightening his tie in a hallway mirror, telling her the only thing that couldn't be taken was their word. He'd been wrong about that, she knew now. Most things could be taken if the right person decided to take them, the word included. But it could also be given back. That was the thing he hadn't known to tell her, maybe because he hadn't needed to know it yet. It could be taken and it could be fought for and it could be returned to the record. And the returning mattered not because it erased the taking, but because it refused to let the taking be the last word on the matter. She finished her coffee. She set the cup on the wall beside her and stood up and looked at the estate grounds. The iron gate at the far end, the gravel path, The east wing with its currently inadequate curtains, the window on the second floor where the study light was on, where Dante was working through whatever came next in the long process of becoming something different from what you were built to be. The watch was in the federal evidence inventory now. She had no need of it. She had not needed it for 20 years. Had carried it through a childhood and an adolescence and into adulthood without knowing she was carrying it, and the carrying had shaped things she couldn't fully account for. The instinct toward protection, the stubbornness, the capacity for walking into a room she hadn't chosen and finding, eventually, her footing. She walked back toward the house. Dante was at the top of the stairs when she came in, jacket off, the particular dishevelment of a man who had been working for hours and had only stopped because the day had finally delivered the one piece of news that made stopping make sense. He looked at her from the landing and she looked up at him, and there was between them what there had been since the altar, that quality of seeing and being seen without the protection of performance, which had been terrifying on the night it started, and had become, incrementally, through the accumulation of everything that had happened since, simply true. "The curtains in the east wing," she said. He looked at her. "My mother thinks they need replacing," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The real version, not the altar smile, not the managing expression, the one she'd seen only a handful of times and which had the effect on her that it had on her. "Your mother is probably right," he said. "She usually is," Avery said, and came up the stairs, and the door of the study was open and the light was on and the corkboard was still there, empty now. The pins removed and the photographs and documents finally returned to the record where they belonged, and the room without all of that evidence looked larger than it had, cleared of its cargo, full of whatever came next. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty board for a moment. Then she walked past it, into the room, and sat down and began.